A new 7-day ceasefire has come into effect in Sudan, but that hasn't stopped the fighting between the army and the paramilitary rapid support forces. The United Nations is calling for security guarantees at the highest level to ensure the movement of desperately needed aid. UN aid chief Martin Griffiths has said it'll be difficult to secure an end to the fighting as the warring parties are keen to keep it going. Mr. Griffiths was speaking after visiting Port Sudan on the Red Sea coast. He said he asked the generals to meet him face to face to try to secure the safe delivery of humanitarian assistance. More than 100,000 people have fled Sudan for neighboring countries. Millions who remain in the capital are struggling to survive due to a lack of basic goods such as food and water.
The fighting needs to stop. And to stop now, before more people die and this conflict explodes into an all-out war that could affect the region for years to come. All parties must put the interests of the Sudanese people first, and that means peace, a return to civilian rule, allowing for the development of the country. I think it's important that the whole of the international community comes together and tells clearly the two generals, but also all those that eventually are taking profit of this, that the present situation is totally unacceptable, that a ceasefire, a lasting ceasefire needs to take place, that a political dialogue needs to be established, and that the transition for a civilian government needs to be guaranteed. Unfortunately, we are not yet there.
The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, well, the Sudanese army, led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, has ruled out any direct negotiations with the rival paramilitary rapid support forces.
There's no responsible government or a state that would accept mediation with those who rebelled against it and caused all of this instability, damage and fighting. Mediation comes in issues lighter than this when there's no military conflict. If the humanitarian ceasefire holds and the motives that made the leader accept it, our delegation will not meet with RSF face to face. Communication will be through mediators.
Well, Arise East Africa correspondent Mark Bichachi has been monitoring developments in the region, and he joins me now live from the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Good to see you, Mark. So gunfire and explosions echoing across Khartoum for a 20th straight day, neither of the warring sides seeming to be ready to abide by that new 7-day ceasefire. So a duel to the death. Is that the latest on the fighting?
Yes, unfortunately, that is the latest, that especially General Burhan has made it very clear that he considers the RSF a rebellion within the army, and he says the only result that he would accept is a total destruction of the RSF. At the same time, we can see that the war has continued despite a 7-day ceasefire, showing that neither side is actually willing to put the guns down and to silence them, either for the sake of their civilians or for the sake of creating peace in the region.
And Mark, I wonder if we have any sense so far of which side is inflicting more damage on which.
Well, it is interesting because towards the north of Khartoum, we've seen that the army has made gains and pushed back the RSF a bit more. However, the RSF is still holding on to the presidential palace, releasing videos from the presidential palace saying that they hold it. So the army may have gained a bit of ground within the north of Khartoum, but the RSF still holds the presidential palace. So it is not a clear sense of who is leading in the battle, but you can tell that the army is working hard to push the RSF out of certain areas, because if you look at the places that are being bombed by the jets, those are predominantly RSF strongholds. That is what is happening, Charles.
So basically, despite all the remonstrations and supposed ceasefires, and despite the international outcry, no evidence of either side trying to nudge their followers to some kind of accommodation. I mean, you don't get that impression at all.
Well, it's not there. Perhaps the RSF is the one that's a bit more, how do you call it, diplomatic, and saying that they are willing to talk a lot more than Burhan is. Burhan is very clear that he considers this a rebellion and he wants to quash it. And you can see from the interview that you just aired a few minutes ago that they believe victory against the RSF is the only acceptable result, even going ahead to state that they would only talk through proxies and not through direct mediation.
And of course, all this absolutely terrible for people on the ground there amid a deepening humanitarian crisis and the rather stark option of either dying from the fighting or possibly dying from starvation.
Yes, indeed, the threat of starvation is becoming very real. As we've discussed before, more than 50 million Sudanese already depended on aid. That aid has become scarcer, especially in Khartoum. We've seen raids of factories that produce bread. We've seen raids even in the Indian consulate. So businesses are slowly shutting down. The flow of commerce is shutting down, and therefore people are finding it harder and harder to access food. We've talked to people who have said that they've been unable to eat for up to 2 days within the city of Khartoum. And with the war intensifying and not ceasing, then very few people are also able to access funds through their banks. The central bank has tried to open branches in 4 different locations across the country of Sudan, but not in the capital. So there is not only a shortage of resources, but now there's also a shortage of the money to access the food that they would otherwise have gotten. Civil servants have gone without pay for the new month, and therefore we expect it to bite even more now that if civil servants are not paid, it has a ripple effect on the economy as well.
So, I mean, I'm curious to know, Mark, what your assessment is of what Martin Griffiths, the UN aid chief, what his visit to Sudan and to the region achieved.
Well, right now, what it seems to have achieved is the restarting of the distribution of food in 4 Sudanese states. That is one. And then number 2, he is pushing very hard to create a humanitarian corridor within Khartoum and the Sudan in general, where the resources coming in to make sure people have food and shelter are able to be achieved. Also, there is a growing push to ensure that those who are running away from the fighting into neighboring countries and also into states that have less fighting are able to receive relief where they are. So those are the 2 things that he is focusing on, even as the international community pushes for there to be a peaceful resolution to this.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. Mark Bichachi is Arise East Africa correspondent, and he was talking to me there from the Kenyan capital, Nairobi.